Hello friends, I'm Aisling and today's list is a list of my top 10 short book recommendations, but the particular order that they're in is that I have ordered these from longest to shortest. So all of these books are under 200 pages. The first one, and at 190 pages, that I would recommend is We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I always assumed that Shirley Jackson maybe wouldn't be for me, and I suppose my interest was piqued when I watched the Haunting of Hill House series maybe about 5 years ago now. But I am actually recommending We've Always Lived in the Castle today. I actually probably preferred this to Hill House. It's really quirky and unusual. So we follow Mary Cat, who lives in this huge house with her sister Constance and their uncle Julian. 7 members of the family used to live there, but one fateful evening some arsenic found its way into the sugar bowl, and although Constance, Mary Cat's sister, was acquitted of the murder, the locals still are very suspicious of the family because nobody was ever convicted of the crime, and it had been Constance who served the sugar that evening, so that's why the blame was placed on her. The locals are especially cruel and dismissive of the remaining members of the family as a whole, and it's very strange and very uncomfortable, really quite quirky, and the interactions between the characters feel really weird, feel really just unusual, and it winds up reading almost like a fairy tale, even though there's nothing kind of fantastical that goes on in this book. Technically no magic or anything like that at all. The house itself also feels like a very important character in the novel, and I really enjoyed this and don't want to say too much more. It does read kind of quite modern as well. It is a modern classic, and for those of you who are a bit reluctant to get into classics, I would say that Shirley Jackson is probably a great entry point. Next up then, and at 180 pages, we have The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa. So this book is quite a beautiful read. It's a Japanese translation, and my edition was translated by, I always think it's really important to mention the translator, translated from the Japanese by Stephen Snyder. So in this book we follow a housekeeper, and she is hired to take care of an aging but brilliant math professor. But he has an unusual problem. He had a traumatic brain injury, and now his memory only lasts for 80 minutes at a time. So he can remember things from his earlier life, but since the accident, anything that's happened since, he just cannot remember over 80 minutes. So he puts sticky notes, post-it notes on everything to remind him of absolutely everything. He forgets the housekeeper every day. He doesn't know who she is. It's quite a difficult situation. He has had other housekeepers before this, but they've all quit because they've just found it a little bit too tough. Although he can only hold new memories for this amount of time, we also see that his mind is actually really alive with so many math equations and just memories in general. The housekeeper is quite an astute woman, and it is actually because of her 10-year-old son that their relationship kind of opens up a bit, and it becomes something like really endearing and really wholesome. There's a gnat flying around in front of my camera. So this 10-year-old boy and the professor develop this relationship through kind of a shared love of math and baseball. And these are two subjects that I would traditionally have absolutely no interest in, but the writing is just on point, and the story is really wholesome and kind of heartbreaking in its own way as well. If you're looking to pick up a quick read that's really heartwarming, I would definitely recommend this one. And don't let the math and the baseball put you off, trust me. Next up then, and coming in at 166 pages, is On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan. This book is up there on my top 10 books of all time. Even if that list changes a little bit every now and again depending on my mood, this book always sits on this list. I finished it on New Year's Eve a few years ago, and it knocked so many books that were high up on that list of favourites from the year. It just knocked most of them down a peg. We follow a couple on their wedding night. So this is a historical fiction kind of literary novel, and they are based in England in 1962, and they are staying in a hotel for their wedding night in Dorset, which is on the coast of England. And They're staying in this hotel and they're having dinner in their rooms that night. We witness them both worrying about the night to come. So this is a time when marriage was deemed to be like the epitome of maturity and independence, and both of them are grappling with this, but also with their own individual kind of worries. It's incredibly awkward. I cannot express this enough. It's so awkward, but it's also really poignant, and we get their backstory as well through sort of memory. And I just honestly thought that this book was so perfect, and I just wasn't expecting it. It also gives really good representation to something that we don't come across in novels all too often, and I really enjoyed that. It was a really nice perspective to see in a historical novel. I reread the last page of this countless times. This is a novel that just completely broke my heart, but in the best way. In the best way. Speaking of heartbreaking, the next book then, coming in at 150 pages, is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, and it probably needs absolutely no introduction. So this is a book that I was aware of for a very long time, but I just didn't pick it up until last year for some reason. You know when you put off a book because you're like, I'll probably enjoy that, so I'll read it when I want to read a book that I want to enjoy. Now I say enjoy lightly because it is a bit of a bleak book, so yeah, keep that in mind. The first thing that really struck me about this book was James Baldwin's writing. It was my first experience of reading a novel of his, and the closest I think I had come to reading any of his stories were like quotes that I kept seeing like around Instagram and stuff, but I just felt like every quote that I read of his was so articulate and so astute, and he had some really well thought out and wonderful ideas about how people should live, and I just knew that I really wanted to read this book. I don't want to give away too much or pretty much anything at all, but this book is definitely darker than I was expecting, and it was quite heart-wrenching, but also in a way that I wasn't expecting. We follow a young American man who is in Paris, and he meets a barman and they start up a relationship. I leave the synopsis at that, but so many of the characters were so morally grey, and even now, like months after reading it, I can't tell you how I truly feel about each of the characters. I do feel like that's a really good sign of a skilled writer when they can write somebody as human and not as just really good or evil, or, you know, not as caricatures. As classics go, I think this one was written in 1956, don't hold me to that, but it is relatively contemporary, and for me, who's somebody who struggles with classics sometimes, I found this one incredibly accessible. Pick it up if you haven't read it. You'll fly through it, and it's really worth it. And then next up, and coming in at 147 pages, is a book by Becky Chambers. So Becky Chambers is really well known for writing like cozy sci-fi, and the book I want to recommend here is A Psalm for the Wild Built. And in this book we follow a tea monk. So this monk was once a monk in a monastery, but increasingly felt the pull to further pastures. So the role of a tea monk basically is that they have themselves a little tea cart, and they travel around from town to town, and people come to them with their problems, with their sadnesses, with their worries, and the tea monk brews them a cup of tea and sits and listens to them and helps to advise them and just helps them to feel a bit better, which honestly I feel is a great thing, and why don't we have a bit more of that in our real world? Centuries beforehand anyway, robots had become sentient, and they laid down their tools, decided they didn't want to work for humans anymore, and they disappeared into the wilderness, never to be seen again. So in current day, people haven't met robots. It's this story from history that almost seems like a fairy tale. But the life of our tea monk is upended when a robot shows up desperate to find out the answer to the question, what do people need? A loaded question. And this is a book that really talks about a world where, you know, where people have everything that they need. Does having more really matter? Will it change things? I found that conversation really interesting. There's also really brilliant non-binary representation in here. Our main character is non-binary, but it's not like the main facet of their personality. It's just a part of the story. And the world was really accepting of this. So, you know, the monks would normally have been called like brother or the nun's sister, but our monk is just called sibling, which I thought was really lovely. And this is a book that's really about like purpose and identity and nature and probably productivity in some ways as well. It's a really lovely read. It kind of felt like a warm hug in a book, and I would 100% recommend this one. Next up then is a book that I don't have a physical copy of, and that is a book that's 145 pages long, and it is Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson. So this is like a literary romance. We follow two young black British people who meet in a pub in southeast London. They're both artists. He's a photographer and she's a dancer, and they're both struggling to make their way in a city that kind of simultaneously accepts and rejects them. They fall in love kind of tentatively and tenderly, but it's not your traditional love story by any means. I think what really makes this book shine is the writing. It's absolutely stunning. I mean, truly. The whole novel just feels really musical, really lyrical, and it focuses so much on what it means to be a person who is only seen as a black body and nothing else. It's a novel about vulnerability and masculinity, racism, art, feelings of displacement, and so much more. It is stunning. Pick it up. Next up then is a novel that comes in at 140 pages, and that is The Lost Daughter by Elena Ferrante. So this is my first and only, so far, Elena Ferrante book, and in this we follow Lida, who is a middle-aged professor and divorcee, and she decides to take a 6-week trip to the south of Italy before the new term begins, and she goes by herself, and what seems to be like an idyllic setting quickly starts to feel claustrophobic and unsettling as Lida becomes obsessed with this young Neapolitan family who frequent the same beach as her, specifically the young mother and daughter duo Nina and Elena. Lida does something that is seemingly quite harmless in the first half of the book, but also without much forethought as to why she does it, and she sets off a train of encounters and events. So this story is interspersed with Lida's memories of her own life and her relationships with her ex-husband and her adult daughters. As such, there's kind of like a stream of consciousness style to the writing that works really well. I'm a sucker for a story that deals with like the unreliable shadow of memory, and this one doesn't disappoint. I can't say that I exactly enjoyed reading this book. It's really difficult to like the protagonist, but maybe that's down to like Ferrante's ability to point out the universal flaws in all of us, and it just makes it a really uncomfortable read. There's a tension throughout that's almost tangible, and I felt genuinely stressed reading this book. Without a doubt, I can tell you that I loved this book, but I can't for a second say that I actively enjoyed reading it. But in that execution, I found it to be quite masterful and would definitely recommend it, and look forward to reading more Elena Ferrante myself. And then next up is a novel that comes in at 139 pages, and that is The Ice Palace by Tarjei Vesaas. I mean, I've tried to pronounce this name on camera so many times, you think I'd have just looked up the pronunciation by now, wouldn't you? This is a Norwegian novel which is translated by Elizabeth Rocken. So this book follows two young girls. I think they're about 11. So we have Sis and we have On, and they're two young friends who have only really spent one proper evening in each other's company, but this evening had such an impact on them that when Un inexplicably disappears, Sis's world is completely shattered. It's a short book, so I won't give too much away, but this one falls into the more literary sphere, and the writing is really lyrical and beautiful. This one really took me to another place in its strangeness. So as the title suggests, the Ice Palace, we are in a world that's completely snowed over, full of ice, and the atmosphere is really tangible in this one, and I really enjoyed it. So speaking of quite wintry books, we have this novel which is 99 pages, and that is a novel called Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Aw. I suppose this is probably classed more as a novella than a novel. So a daughter travels to Japan with her mother in an attempt to kind of reconnect the both of them, or even to just build kind of an initial connection maybe. Japan is a foreign place to them both, so they're kind of both on even footing. The daughter, who is our narrator, imparts to us like a feeling of kind of loneliness while in the midst of trying to understand not just herself but also her mother and her relationship with her mother. It deals with questions such as how much of ourselves kind of come from our parents through biology alone, what parts of us can be said to have been shaped by the memories that our parents kind of impart on us from their experiences, and also like what is it within us that keeps us from kind of fully communicating our inner selves with the people around us. I think that anybody who has ever perhaps tried or even failed to find some common ground with a parent will really relate to this much more deeply. So I love a book that really kind of delves into memory and what shapes us, and this book really ticks those boxes. And then last but certainly not least, at a mere 90 pages, we have an Irish novel called Foster by Claire Keegan. And if you've been around a while, you will have heard me bang on about this novel time and time again. So Foster follows a young girl in Ireland who is whisked away from her parents and her family one summer as her parents prepare to have another baby. She is unfamiliar with these relatives, so she feels really uncomfortable, doesn't really know what's going on, and we're not really told why she in particular of all her siblings are sent. There's evidence of the girl coming from a home where she doesn't quite find the love that she deserves, and in time we can see her receiving that warmth and affection from these relatives. It's one that's set in rural Ireland, so its backdrop is one that for me is entirely just wonderfully nostalgic, but also it's laced throughout with kind of an underlying sadness. This was one of my favourite books the year that I read it, if not one of my favourite books of all time. It's really atmospheric, really slow. Claire Keegan's writing, as ever, is really sparse, really beautiful. There's no word wasted. The setting and the landscape are just perfect, and there's this kind of underlying feeling of us not really getting the whole story sometimes as well. I just thought it was so beautifully done. And this film has actually been adapted to the big screen into an Irish language film called An Colleen Cuan, or in English The Quiet Girl. I think it was nominated for Best International Film a couple of years ago at the Oscars. I loved it, and if you really like this book, I think it's the kind of film that you'd really enjoy as well. It's absolutely stunning. As bonuses, I would also recommend any of Claire Keegan's books. They're all particularly short and they're all set in Ireland. They all have this lovely Irish background, this kind of underlying sense of something else going on. She's such a stunning author, and if you like Irish kind of literary reads, she's definitely up there for me in the list of recommendations. And so that's all the books that I'm going to recommend today. I hope you find something in here that might help you a little bit out of a reading slump. That said, a lot of these books are quite slow. Let me know if there are any short, impactful books that you would really recommend. And if you've enjoyed this video, of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, I hope you're minding yourself, and thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you in another video next week. Bye bye.